Hey, it's Brock here with Rock Hill Farms, and today we want to talk about what happens when you run your tractor out of fuel or if something else causes you to get air in your fuel lines. Now, I'd always heard that if you run a tractor out of fuel, you have a major problem, like you're going to spend all day trying to get this tractor started. But as someone with a lot of experience, you're kind of explaining to me that that really depends on the type of engine that you're looking at.
Yeah, so there's two main types of fuel delivery systems on diesel engines on the market today. The most prevalent new equipment available is common rail fuel injection. So in a common rail system, your fuel is being delivered by an ECU controlling a high pressure fuel pump on the tractor, and the other type of system is going to be a mechanical fuel injection pump like most older style tractors are going to have.
So I guess the first question is, how do you tell what kind of engine you have?
Yeah, so the easiest way to tell on a mechanical fuel injection tractor, you're going to have a very basic system. You're going to have a lift pump, whether it's driven off of vacuum or electrically driven. It's going to be a low pressure pump providing fuel to the higher pressure pump. On the mechanical fuel injection, that higher pressure pump is going to not have a lot of electronic components tied in with it. If you don't see an electrical harness with multiple wires plugged into your injection pump, then most likely that is a mechanical injection pump. The other place to look is on the injectors themselves going into the head of the unit. So the mechanical injection injectors are not really injectors at all. You can actually call them more of a nozzle. So there's not going to be much there aside from just a line going into what looks like a nut bolted onto the head of the tractor.
So the first thing you're going to do if you run out of fuel is just put some fuel in it and check to see if it starts real quick.
Yeah, just fill the tractor up and try to start it. More often than not, if you have a common rail tractor, it might start sputtering, but it's going to catch itself and start, and after running for maybe 30 seconds or a couple minutes, it's going to purge the air out of the lines by itself. Now that's one of the benefits to a common rail injected engine. Mechanical fuel injected engine, if it completely runs out of diesel fuel, the likelihood of you sitting there and cranking and getting it to start at all is pretty low. If you are lucky enough to get it to sputter and fire, then there's a couple of tricks that we can show you to get the tractor going, but more than likely you will get no response, just cranking, and we can show you how to fix that as well.
So before we get into the older tractors and the mechanical fuel injection, is there any other tips or advice if you have, like my little John Deere, or you have a new Kubota and you know that it is the common rail and it doesn't want to start and run? Is there any other things you want to look at?
If you believe it's just a fuel issue and it's cranking, it won't start, or it's still stumbling and doesn't ever come back to full power, you need to contact a dealer immediately and see if you can make an appointment to bring your tractor in or have them come out, because likely what needs to happen is they'll have to plug in electronically to the tractor and run what's called a fuel purge or an air purge cycle to get the remainder of the air out of the fuel system.
So the mechanical fuel injection on this Branson tractor and on the TYM 574 that I'm running is one of the reasons I wanted that machine. It can be an advantage, but in this case it's going to make things more complicated. So let's start looking at what we're going to do on this machine right here, and we're actually just going to run it out of fuel and not just talk about it. We want to really show you what happens. I wanted to add one more note while he's draining the fuel out of this, and that is that mostly I'm 100% a DIY guy. I don't like to hire anyone to do anything. And you'll notice Jake went straight to, on your common rail, call the dealership. And that's really just how it is. Most of the time they'll resolve themselves, but if they don't, and you try some of this other stuff we're about to do, you can actually do damage, especially with the injectors. You really just don't want to mess with the injectors on a common rail. So, if it won't start, you're just going to have to get some help. It feels so wrong to intentionally run this out of fuel.
I don't feel right about it.
Yeah. Luckily, this tractor doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to him. We break it, we'll just leave and say we didn't know what happened. Besides growing up around tractors and working on his own stuff, Jake owns a dealership and he manages the service department. So he has personally been called out to dozens, if not hundreds, of tractors that had air in the fuel lines or were run out of fuel. So he has a lot of personal experience dealing with this. So he removed the fuel bowl and took off the line. No diesel going to it, and it took it about 5 minutes to run out of fuel.
She just didn't want to die.
I'd say this tractor sips the fuel at idle anyway.
So before we get into how to bleed the air out of this fuel system, I want to just go over a few of the major components so that you're aware of what I'm talking about as I go through the process. So obviously the first thing, like we talked about, we want to go ahead and fill the diesel tank full of fuel, which we've already done. And then let's check out the first place the fuel goes from the tank. And on this tractor, the first place it goes is actually through this lift pump. Sometimes you'll have a primary filter, whether it be in the tank, and this one may have one in the tank, but you may have a primary fuel filter before this lift pump. But this is the little electrical pump that's pulling the fuel from the tank, pushing it through this fuel filter into the mechanical injection pump. From the mechanical injection pump, the fuel travels from these 4 lines up to these 4 injection nozzles, going right in here to the intake of the head of the tractor. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is fill this fuel filter full of fuel and verify that I have fuel flowing through that fuel filter. And we're basically going to make sure that we're pushing fuel all the way through the system to the injection point where we ultimately need fuel to be to start the tractor. Okay, so after we've got the fuel tank filled, we need this lift pump to push fuel through this fuel filter, and to verify that that fuel filter has filled to the top. Sometimes there will be a bleed screw at the top, and sometimes there won't be. In this case, there's not, and I'm going to just take this fuel line loose, which I've already done, going from the fuel filter over to the injection pump. So I know that this fuel filter is full of fuel once I have steady flow coming out of that filter. And in order to get the fuel to flow, in this case, since we have an electronic lift pump, I'm just going to turn the key on and let it run. Now sometimes you'll, on older tractors or some small 25 horsepower tractors I've seen that have some vacuum driven pumps, or pumps that are actually driven off of a secondary part of your fuel injection pump or the crankshaft, you won't be able to just throw the key on and allow that fuel to fill up. So an easy way to tell is if I turn the key on, I can hear that fuel pump going and it's already filled that fuel filter. If you don't get that pretty quickly, you know that you either have a lift pump problem or your lift pump isn't electronic and you might need to hand prime it.
Now, if we had actually ran it out of fuel, the lines up to that pump would be empty and it would take an extra 10 seconds of running.
Right. So now that I see that I've got a good steady stream of fuel going through the fuel filter, I'm going to go ahead and throw that line on. And I'm going to let it run for just a few seconds so that that fuel runs through this line and fills the space within this injection pump full of fuel.
Now, right now, with that having run fuel up to there, would you say that we've got a 50-50 chance of it starting, or is it unlikely right now?
I would say it's unlikely that the tractor is going to start right now, given that we completely ran it out of fuel and then cranked it with no fuel at all delivering through the nozzles. Now, we can certainly try, and at this point I normally do, and see if I can get the tractor to stumble or at least try to fire. I'm lucky this thing is fired up. So So in this case, it's unlikely that we're going to get the tractor to run how we want it to. It'll probably still stumble and sputter. It's hard to tell, but it's not quite getting the maximum power that it should. So in my case, this tractor's running. It fired up after I let it prime itself. But I want to make sure that all of the air is out of the lines, and there's two general ways that I can do that. And the first way that I like to try, if this thing's still spitting and sputtering, is I want to try to find the fuel line from the injection pump that returns to the fuel tank. So in this case, that fuel line is sitting right on top of this injection pump, and it's this soft hose. And generally it's a soft line. So what you can do is either get some fuel line pliers, some vice grips, or just have a buddy hold the fuel line like this while you're running the tractor for 2 minutes and allow that tractor, basically what it does is allows the air, or I guess more so prevents the air from traveling through that hose to the tank, and rather forces it through the injection pump, through the nozzles, into the intake.
I'm easily confused. Tell us again how you determined that was the line to pinch off.
Yeah, so what you want to do is make sure you're finding the line that goes from the injection pump to the fuel tank. So if I follow this line, I'm going to see that it travels back towards that tank. And what that line generally does is it just takes fuel that's unused in the injection process and returns it back to the tank. So that every mechanical fuel injection pump will have that line. You just need to locate it and trace it. So that's generally the easiest, best case scenario if you still have air in the fuel lines. If that doesn't work and you've run it for a couple minutes and you're still not getting all the air out, it's still stumbling, you're not getting full power, then what you'll need to do is find your injectors, which in this case are pretty easily visible, but they may not all be easy to get to. And you'll want to crack open with the wrench. I think this is a 17. You'll crack this open about a half turn, 3/4 turn, and crank the tractor, run the tractor, allow it to spray fuel out of that injector. It'll just kind of shoot up the line a little bit and pull on top of the engine. But you can go one by one and open those lines up and allow fuel to flow out to continue to bleed the system. Sometimes you can do all three of these steps and the engine still hasn't started. So it may take the longest just to bleed these lines out if you're still not getting it to start after performing the fuel pump bleed and then performing the clamp method. If those two things don't work and it still hasn't started, what I'll normally do is back off all 4 injectors, or all 3, whatever it might be, and just sit there and crank on it, allow that fuel to flow out all 4 injection points for a couple minutes, just like we ran the lift pump, and then tighten them all down and try starting it again. So if you wind up needing to crack the injector lines, I'm just going to show you on one of these how you would do that. So I'm going to take this injector loose about 3/4 of a turn total. And if you can't get to all the injectors with a typical wrench, a good option to look into is a crow's foot, a set of crow's feet. So now I've got that cracked open enough that fuel is going to be able to flow through the path of least resistance, which is now out of this seal. So you can watch as I crank this tractor over as it runs, that fuel will flow. There it goes.
So I actually have never ran a tractor out of fuel, but I did run the mini skid steer out, and it's a new machine with a Kubota diesel engine in it, and I would guess that that's going to have common rail fuel system, and I had a hard time getting it to start again, Actually, it started up pretty easy, but then every time I would try to apply throttle or move the machine, it would kill it. And I had to let it run for like 15 minutes, and then it worked itself out. But I've heard some real horror stories from people fighting all day trying to get an older tractor to start. And hopefully, these tips here have been helpful to you. I appreciate you taking time to watch the video. I'll put links on the screen to a couple more of our videos, and I'll see you next time.